Hello and welcome to Acumen Analysis, the show where we talk about economics, market conditions and politics and how that impacts you and your business.
Hello and welcome to Acumen Analysis, episode 6, where we're talking about conflicts globally, of which we've seen plenty of new ones. It's an unusual world out there. We've seen very unusual behaviour from all sorts of world leaders, good and bad. And we're today talking about how that's going to impact business or trade and specific sectors in some cases. And today we've got Stuart again, who, as I've mentioned in the past, is a qualified accountant with an economics degree and has a bit of an unusual spin on the world, to say the least.
Thank you, Edmund, for that introduction. We are certainly in interesting times. And there seems to be wars popping up on a far too frequent basis. I think that's signs of the tension that is just flowing down the world at the moment. And I think we should all think about how that impacts us. I think certainly if you coming from a UK perspective, the general mood is we're feeling the pinch, whether that's due to taxes or higher interest rates or inflation. There's energy prices. There seems to be that pinch. But with these pinches comes angst and unrest, and ultimately that can boil down into wars, and it's not very nice. And what I think you're seeing is a number of instances around the world where politicians have chosen to press the big button and send the army in. We've had Trump deciding to go into Venezuela, and depending on your definition of success, he seems to certainly have achieved a lot of outcomes in a very short period of time. I don't know if that's good for democracy or bad for democracy, but I think it's quite interesting if you were a businessman. If Venezuela is known for doing a lot of oil business. And if you're involved in any way, your supply chain is involved in the oil industry, you're going to see an impact. You're going to see that shortage of supply affecting prices.
It's hard for anyone to say that they're not in some way, shape or form impacted by oil prices. It seems to impact everything virtually.
I think that's a fair point.
So let's look at the UK just at a glance, I suppose. And we've been impacted in the UK by things like the Ukraine conflict or war or special military operation, whatever you want to call it. And that's obviously impacted energy prices. We've had a lot of talk about energy in the last couple of years. I suppose many are sort of wondering whether, Iran becoming more vocal within the last couple of weeks again, and the Venezuela sort of thing that's just happened. I don't even know what to call it, because it's like Trump's just gone in there and taken someone out, and I don't know what's going to happen next. But businesses and individuals in the UK and globally are going to be thinking, how's that going to impact me?
Well, look, I think war causes a number of things. It starts off, obviously, the impact on life and transport. So moving goods in and out is often difficult. But when the lawyers then get involved and say, they've decided that this has not been good behaviour, or they're trying to change a country's behaviour, you end up with tariffs. We've certainly seen Trump in the last 12 months really starting to use tariffs, weaponizing tariffs really, whereas before they were just a way of equalizing economics for certain goods. You've got that, but you've also got things like sanctions, where it becomes illegal to do certain trade. And that's normally driven around protection of life, stopping wars. So you don't want to give Russia, for example, goods that would be able to aid their military. Iran is in sanctions on anything to do with nuclear proliferation, for example. But that doesn't mean that those countries are dealing with those countries or supply chains into those countries are a no-no. What it means is you've got additional risks and complexity in dealing with them. So let's try and pick up those bits individually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to sort of see everything that happened as a result of Ukraine and Russia going in with regards to sanctions, and then only to hear it on the news that essentially the economy, whilst sort of injured or suppressed to some degree, it wasn't having the drastic impact that the EU or the United States really had hoped for. They were hoping that the economy would really grind to a halt and that would kind of make Russia kind of go into a state of limping along. Basically.
I mean, for an ex-socialist country, it's been quite impressive how it's managed to remain nimble and change its model in the wake of what are fairly extreme sanctions. I mean, the country itself is mobilized, I think 30% of its economy is now defense spend. Now, I think it is a huge economic challenges at the moment and strife because the world has really said we're not really willing to deal with Russia. There are countries that are not taking that stance. India and China are an example. There are countries where they probably below the radar screen, people are still dealing with it. And that's one of the arguments, apparently, that justified Trump going into Venezuela, these shadow ships taking illegal oil around the world. Whatever the truth of that is, you're seeing really three perspectives. One, we're locking it down, you can't deal with them. Two, we don't care, we're not dealing with them. And then some sort of hybrid in the middle, where sanctions apply in certain circumstances to certain people if they bother. So again, you're running a business. How do you deal with that?
Yeah,
you have to know your supply chain. I mean, the green energy world and carbon reporting is saying you should know it anyway. GDPR rules have said you should know your supply chain so you know where your private data is going, personal data is going. But now what we're saying is for resilience in your own supply chain, you need to know whether you are going to be impacted. And it's just not just about whether you buy semiconductors from Taiwan or oil from Venezuela. It's whether your supply chain does, whether your suppliers and your suppliers, etc., are going to be impacted. And dialogue is always the best way. Asking your suppliers if they have done any risk assessments. Have they been liaising with their suppliers? Do they envisage anything? If you're in industry groups, what are your competitors doing?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is largely outside of everyone's control. I mean, if the Venezuela thing became an all-out war, I think people would be more worried about oil prices going through the roof, supply demand, normal things. But I suppose, on the other hand, if essentially Trump is going to start running that country, and start increasing oil production, that might do the opposite.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at how much risk you're willing to take. You cannot avoid risk here. Something has happened, and you are not in an ability to control it. What you can do is react to it. And so you need to be live on top of the news feeds to try and understand. You need to get information and make a judgment call. But ultimately, you can decide whether you think you should be dealing with, in this countries or businesses which have got some sort of sanctioned, embargoed or tariff risk or not. And many people want to buy and sell goods from the EU, and yet there are tariffs applied. People have made a value judgment or an ethical judgment to say that's acceptable, but people are also making that judgment whether they want to deal with South Africa, Venezuela, Russia, Iran. It's a personal choice. People make value judgments all the time, and you cannot criticize someone for their judgment call, so long as they've thought it through with their own value-based judgments. So, for example, you might turn around and say, we're not willing to deal with Russian businesses because of Putin. Likewise, you could turn around and say, actually, we are willing to deal with them, but it's on different terms. It's on the terms that I think justify dealing with Russian business. Now, you have to bear in mind that the legislators as well have put their own value judgments on and put it in law. So you can't flout them. You're going to have to accept there is increased cost if you do choose to deal with them. But likewise, you might be forced to, because if you don't do that, and you don't deal with them, you're picking up the consequences of not dealing with those people. Along with, like many things, if you ever do your SWOT analysis, what is a threat is often an opportunity. And again, I think people need to be nimble enough to think that through and decide whether they want to deal with the headache of the additional complexities which have been arisen around the world because of global conflict.
Yeah. And I suppose putting Venezuela to one side, because mostly oil, I think, is what we think.
Oil and drugs. I mean, we can't do much. We can't comment on the drugs. But
if you're a drug dealer, maybe the price of drugs is going up as well.
I'm not sure this is the right podcast.
This is
for
the wrong
you either.
podcast. But, so that's what we think the main impact will be, sort of cost of shipping, maybe cost of transport generally. We've also seen over the last few weeks, China doing probably the most they've done with respect to sort of military drills around Taiwan. We're not sure whether that's a serious kind of step forward in them, taking the next ultimate step, essentially. But
that's an unusual, political debate around the history of Taiwan, and probably not one that we're best qualified to talk about. But if you look at Venezuela, over the last few months, you've seen the odd ship being taken by America from the Shadow Fleet, as it's called, and now it's hard to get insurance for ships. So often these were the ones that couldn't be insured. They're too old, etc. They've been trapped. But now we're seeing ships that were normal ships stuck in Venezuelan ports and choosing not to leave because they don't want to take the risk. Now that we've had I'm going to use the word invasion, don't know if that's the right word, but invasion by the US into Venezuela, maybe the world will say, or these shipping captains will say, it's safer, we can now go out because the trouble is more behind us than in front of us.
Yeah, fair enough.
That again is a judgment call for people to make. I'm not sure, in the absence of really what the military strategy is going to be from the US, you can make a call with any knowledge. You just got to do the best you can with the information you have available to you.
There's a good chance of delays on shipments of oil and
absolutely.
And all the rest of it.
Again, the greater in times of strife, the greater resilience you have as a business, the better. That's but having good, strong supply chains, choice of suppliers, possibly products that you can choose different components for, greater level of stock, financial resources to deal with slower payers, or your suppliers or customers struggling to pay. All those sort of things are valuable.
I know at one point Iran had to deal with Venezuela. They were doing 2-for-1 on crude oil barreled for refined, which fell over really quickly because Venezuela couldn't keep up with the sort of quotas, basically. But I don't know to what extent that was carrying on even ad hoc, where places like Iran were struggling to sell their oil, for example, and then using Venezuela again, a bit like Russia. But anyway, on the China kind of military drills around Taiwan point, say, for example, China does decide to ultimately take back what they believe is theirs. What do we think the impact would be, the knock-on effect would be to businesses, and if any, some specific sectors?
Well, I've not been there, so I can't talk through the geography, but it's a short trip by boat. And I think you want to be well advised to keep away. In terms of long-term, I think what's happened in Hong Kong would probably be your assumption around the general direction of political travel. A promise of independence and self-governance, and then that would disappear into Chinese governance. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different value judgment call. Some people like it, some people won't. But you need to be aware of it. And I think, at the moment, Taiwan's, one of the market leaders, if not the market leader in semiconductor chips. That requires a lot of critical components that China, I believe, have got a large say over the availability of. So that might actually be quite good for us of semiconductor once the noise and disruption of invasion has sort of settled down to whatever normality afterwards is. There might be some benefits to it, to sadly to the businesses, sadly for the people that are struggling in the conflict though. But likewise, it could turn around and say, actually, it's the complete opposite. All the factories have been destroyed and Taiwan loses its market dominance or market leadership in that industry. War is the biggest destructor of economic value. Even if you look at it from a military perspective, you build all these bombs, put all these millions of pounds into bombs. And what do you do with it? You blow it up. You turn it literally into smithereens. It's just a value destructive wherever you look.
And I suppose what's particularly interesting about what's going on there and we've just talked about the US and Venezuela, but the US and China have they've almost been like sending things over the fence, trade, combating with trade.
Yeah, it's we've got an interesting world at the moment, and certainly the Trump view of the world, if we want to call it the US view, we can. It's very much pushing an American influence on the world. Now, it's probably always been there in the Western world anyway. It's always been there, but not as expressive, not as so pro-US. EU was very much aligned towards a Western philosophy, underpinned, of course, that was a NATO, America being supportive of that. If we don't have a NATO, we have America looking insular again. And does that create a vacuum where other countries and other philosophies will start taking influence? Probably, undoubtedly, in my view. We've seen the rise of I'm going to call it the Asian tiger, if that's the right phrase, certainly coming to fore. And I think you're going to end up with this dichotomy of the world.
Yeah, it feels like people are picking sides a little bit right now.
Yeah.
Don't know what it's revving up towards, but, there's been the BRICS nations coming together.
Yeah, I think that's kind of sort of...
Bit dead.
Yeah, I think it's kind of never quite achieved what it was trying to do. It was always if we're not in the gang, we'll create another gang sort of philosophy.
Was it India who bailed out of that one?
I can't remember, but it's certainly one of the countries bailed. But I think you're certainly going to have a Chinese-centric world, and you're going to have in my view, California, but a US-centered world. And, the Middle East, as usual, very canny, sits in the middle, geographically as well as politically, morally, economically, everything is quite astute. But there are lots of countries there, so there's probably pick the right one. But Europe has clearly got a Western influence to it. But if you start looking at Azerbaijan and what we call the former Russian states on the south side, they've got in India, you've got a much more Chinese flavour and influence, I'd have thought. The question really comes to something like Australia. It's a sizable economy. No, I mean, not the size of some of the bigger ones, but it's a reasonably sized economy. Very close relation to other countries, to China and places like that. And there's a growing influence of China in Australia. But culturally, they're much more aligned to European and American philosophy. So there's quite an interesting world is going to play out in Australasia. So, it's a very hard one to pick. Again,
Australia also has a huge amount of trade with China, don't they?
Yeah,
on the natural
absolutely.
resources front, but they're exporting huge amount of minerals and precious metals and all the rest of it, I think.
But it's much harder for them to export to Europe. The cost of transport is a bit prohibitive. So there's an acknowledgement there. But it creates a very interesting world at the moment. And again, it goes back to, if you're running a business, you've got some ethical questions of how do you deal with geopolitical tensions. Nobody should say automatically the answer is no, but you've got to think through what you want, what you believe in. Is it the right thing to do to trade with people, even though some of the world disagrees with it? Is it the wrong thing to do? What do your staff think? What does your supply chain think? If you have to publish reports to big PLCs as to what you do, will they have issues with it? You have to sign reports or sign off assessments to their supply chain. You've got to think about a whole bunch of things, but ultimately it comes back down to, have you thought about it? And what are the consequences of those deliberations? And have you got resilience in it? So if you choose not to deal with Russia, Iran, Venezuela, America, whatever your perspective is, absolutely fine. But can you afford not to deal with those countries? And that's the question that comes into it. And then the question, what's the moral side of it? You could very easily say, look, you know what? I believe that people in the UK need to comply with UK laws. I will do whatever I can to help them apply UK laws. That's the job, Rob. So actually, as far as science, as long as it's legal for me to do so, I will help them comply with UK laws. That's my job. Mm-hmm. It's not to do with Russia, Iran, America, Venezuela, China, Taiwan. Nothing to do with that. It's UK laws. Perfectly valid view. And then you buy and sell goods or services to follow that view.
We've got also quite a number of other conflicts, which was kind of came out of the blue. In my view, they came out of the blue. The US has done some military strikes on Nigeria because of the conflicts there. Doesn't feel like one that's going to impact a lot of the businesses I'm aware of, but I'm sure it'll impact someone. There's much more instability at the end of the day.
Yeah, ultimately, there's two ways of looking at this, right? It's down to the reason for it is a single incident where someone's being punished for some supposed indiscretion, whether that's a kidnapping, whether that's a theft, whether that's some exploitation or something, whatever it is. Right? We can argue that Trump going into Venezuela is about drugs. We could argue about he's trading with Russia and the shadow fleet. We could argue anything. Ultimately, that is one option. The other one is there is a political desire to conquer. Now, I want to take back that land. I want those minerals. I want whatever I want. And two different perspectives. And I don't think sitting around this table in these chairs, we have an idea as to what is going through the mind of these people that make the decisions. But I'm not sure many people do. So you're asking them to second guess what's going on. I mean, you just have to look at the one conflict which we haven't mentioned. We could argue the modern conflict's gone on since the Second World War, but before that were several thousand years. And, there's no right and there's no wrong answer. And, I think that if you take sides in that one, you got to be fairly sure of your rationale, because you're going to annoy an awful lot of people that don't agree with you. And I think, like anything in the world, if you want to disagree with someone, try and do so in solid ground. So be clear of your rationale. Make sure you can articulate to your supply chain and your employees and potentially your customers why you've taken certain decisions. Again, it all comes back down to transparency and communication. Most stakeholders in a business, so by stakeholders I mean employees, customers, suppliers, like your values if they thought about them. Some of them are just taking your money for the product or service they provide, but others are saying, you know what, I like what you're doing, whether that's your carbon footprint, the quality of your product. Now you make sure you deliver for me, or whether it's you've always given me the best prices, whatever it is, you like the way you do business. So you should be able to just spin that ability to meet the needs of your customer base and apply that ethics to the decision that you think is right, because ultimately you're applying the same mind, yours, to the decision. So it should just be a logical extension. Over the development of your own viewpoint, you have started in one position and ended up at another on these topics. So I think it's about articulation. And, you got to decide how upfront you wish to be about it. Some people, it's a private matter, it's a personal matter. I tend to think religion is not a place in business, it's a personal matter. Your choice of religion, how you choose to practice your faith, if you have one. But not everyone takes that view, and it's not for me or others to.
Yeah. On a slightly more, I suppose, business-centric note, and again to do with more conflicts, especially because we've got so many clients in the Middle East who might have subsidiaries in the UK or vice versa. Saudi and the UAE are kicking off. Seems. Not sure I fully understand what's going on there.
Well, it looks to me as if they've almost got the perfect conflict of choosing to fight over a third-party country. So neither of them are actually in their own grounds having an issue. There's a conflict of how you deal with Yemen. And Yemen's been a thorn in the backside of many a country that has tried to get themselves involved in the Middle East over the years. So, there's a bit of tension going around there. Again, but what does it mean for you? Well, it means if you do getting goods from ships. So presumably we're not looking at services. Presumably we're not looking at things that get flown in like microchips. We're looking at the heavy industries, whether that's oil, machinery, cars. And if they have to go through somewhere nearby Yemen, then you have to have concern about whether those boats will make it.
That's quite a major trade route going through.
Absolutely.
And, it's funny, even though I wasn't buying anything that's particularly heavy, I did have stuff that I was even ordering that was delayed because of the conflict in that region.
I would have thought if you're buying a car from China, and many cars are made in China now, then I suspect there'll be an increase in delay. Now, it might, you saw what happened in the Suez, that boat gets stuck in not the Suez Canal, Suez Canal. The boat gets stuck in the Suez Canal. But you saw the delay it happened. Global shipping was ground to a halt for a period of time because that boat that was meant to already have docked to be ready to the next ship couldn't get there. So we're living in a world where we took the Japanese manufacturing philosophy to the extreme, just in time. Well, I learned in the 80s in my studies, that was the way to go. Minimal stock, learn from all the mistakes that happened in the manufacturing, iron them out, celebrate the failures because they give you lessons to learn for the future. All that. And what it's done is, yes, made business much more efficient, but much less resilient. So all these things all these knocks, whether it gets to war or it's just conflict, even if it's just negotiating with a supplier, it all causes potential disruption to your business. Ultimately, you have to pay. It's the one thing the public sector never realizes: time costs money.
Yeah, and I suppose we'll get on to solutions in a second, but do we think businesses who have to rely on having a certain reserve of stock are therefore going to start increasing their stock levels because of the amount of conflict we're seeing, the amount of turmoil, because they just cannot rely on, they can't survive without a major delay like that? You've
seen that around the time when sanctions have been announced on various products. Those products are suddenly sold out. Not because they can't be sold, but because they can't be sold from that country, but they're already in your country. Hopefully you, but somebody just buys up all the stock. We saw it in the pandemic, down to a really crude level. The shelves in the supermarket were empty, whether that was chicken or toilet paper. Somebody went around and made sure that because they was worried about availability. So people react. People buy more chicken breast, more toilet paper, more semiconductor chips, whatever it is, when they feel they're not going to be able to get any in the future. And, if you take war, for example, you look at, I think Russia's been using chips for fridges. Now, in my view, I'm not particularly, an engineering expert, but, to me, a fridge probably is a chip to put the light on and off and probably to regulate the temperature. And that's kind of it. And they've turned them into chips to manage for missiles. So you've got to think that's a really resilient way of making your supply chain work for you in times of trouble. So again, think about what you can do to your supply chain. It's very easy sitting here around this table, go, yeah, my products couldn't change, my services can't change. That's the only way I deliver it. You know what? When you have to, it's amazing how inventive the human mind can be.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point because, well, I mean, I presume it was. I presumed it was like smart fridges actually. So it's something a bit more clever.
Well, maybe you're right.
But you're right. Having a supply chain that where there's no sort of single point of failure, I suppose, is kind of critical.
And if you look at an industry, forgetting war, and let's look at an industry. So the UK has got an oil and gas industry centred out in Aberdeen. And it's been very successful. Now we've had political views that we don't like the carbon footprint that produces.
As a country.
As a country, as a world, we're against the carbon footprint. So we don't really like oil, and the majors have had to dabble at, say some have gone more less dabbling and more active, but they've had to move into sort of green initiatives or looking more green than they were. But what does that mean to people in Aberdeen? Have they lost all energy? No. They've reinvented how to do things. Yes, some of the faces have changed. So the big oil majors are no longer there. There's the next tier that's now leading the oil and gas of that. But they've reinvented themselves. It's still energy. You've still got wind. You've still got solar. You've still got hydro. You just deploy your engineering skills to another method, or your finance skills something else. And of course, on the side of that, there's loads of other opportunities. It's not just oil and gas or energy. There's lots of other things. And Aberdeen is still a thriving place.
Yeah, absolutely.
In transition, but it's still thriving. But the whole UK, quite frankly, is in transition the whole world from a decarbonisation drive.
Yeah. And actually in COVID, we saw loads of new businesses start up from, people were losing their jobs in certain industries like hospitality, travel, and then starting up new jobs and pivoting very, very quickly off the back of major global change.
As far as when my kids were young, I used to go to a sort of softball place. I've seen lots of ones in London where it's quite small. When I'm back up home to Scotland, and where my wife's from, which is Greenock, and there's a massive one of these old port warehouses. And the chap had been made redundant from IBM, which is the big employer in the area. And he used redundancy money to take a lease on it's a massive warehouse. And he's built the biggest softball place I've seen. The kids are loving it. And the kids are now getting we're far too old for it now, but they got a second one of these big warehouses next to it. And, it's a sign of how you could be inventive when you have to be. And I think, it's great to see that the human mind and the human ability is resilient, it's inventive, it's creative. So you need to do the same skills with your business. It's where the public sector often goes wrong. It's how we've always done it. We've always done this. We always pay for this. We always tax that. Why? Challenge it all. I'm not saying you want to chop and change all the time, but nothing should be stuck to forever.
Yeah, that's one of the things that the public sector doesn't have to deal with quite in the same way. They don't get that external pressure to quickly pivot or quickly change what they're doing to survive.
I'm laughing because I think we haven't got the external pressure to change, and yet we've now got, I don't know if it's Rachel Reeves or it's Keir Starmer, but one of them has announced a change to the IHT on farmers, on agricultural property and business property relief, due to, one can only assume, external pressure. Keir Starmer was getting grilled in the Commons, absolutely grilled about how he wasn't listening to anybody. And a week later, there's a I'm going to call it a U-turn, which I think will help many businesses. It's still going to cause problems for the ones that are successful and larger ones, but it's a start.
Yeah, okay. That's a policy change from external factors, and there's quite a significant amount of uproar across the whole country. I think we're talking about more like operational changes. We were talking about businesses pivoting in the way they do things to deal with global change and stuff like that.
The UK, if you look at, we've had a lot of strikes recently. Now we could argue that is people who have been disadvantaged choosing to take the opportunity of a Labour government to fight for their corner where they were more likely to be heard. And that is probably an element of truth to that. But we could also say is people are fighting for their position in society, however you want to define that, whether that's financial earnings or some other means. I mean, the doctor's strike to me seems exactly that. They're not fighting for pay per se. They're fighting for relative pay, to be restored to the relative position they were in earnings that they were back in 15, 16 years ago. And that means if everybody else went up, their pay was doubled, the doctors say our pay should also have been doubled. So they're looking for relative pay. That's them fighting their corner. Within the country, they're saying, we want more relative to others. Now, that's capitalism also at work, let's be absolutely clear. But it's a sign of a little bit of conflict, a little bit of disagreement. How do you insulate yourself? And really what I say is all your businesses need to be resilient. Every business has to be resilient. You need to know what your risks are and try and adjust for it. You're unlikely to know a war is happening. Most people don't get wind of it, because if you did, it would spread and the defences would be stronger. So there's an element of secrecy around it. But you could probably work out that we've elected a Labour government funded by the unions, that certain parts of society which are heavily unionised would seek to use the opportunity for gain. What does that mean? Well, if your supply chain or your customers are affected, how would that mean? If it's your customers, then you're probably going to have a bit of short-term pain while they're striking and not get the same pay. But, if the strike's successful and they get more pay, then they might have more money to spend on your goods and services. If your suppliers are effectively going to strike, then you've got to worry about how you deliver your services, goods, and how what you have to pay them for wages.
I mean, I think that's not a bad point to actually start talking about what are some of the solutions. Lots of this is out of the control of a business owner or someone who runs a business. But, let's talk about hedging. What is hedging? Would it help with things like oil prices?
Yeah. So if you're, again, let's look at insurance is the first one, right?
Yeah.
Now, insurance is great. Some big organization that's big enough to afford it, and is regulated to ensure that should always be the case, who's big enough to afford it, has made a promise that if something happens, it will pay you. But it has carve-outs. It says not in times of war. So you need to sit there and think, does this qualify as a time of war? Now, I'm not an insurance expert, but I don't think America going into Venezuela would negate a policy in the UK around oil prices. I'm not sure you've actually got an event you can claim on either, but I don't think your policy is necessarily negated because of war.
What kind of insurance are we talking about?
Doesn't matter. I'm just trying to think general insurance. I'm not getting into the specifics of bespoke insurance. So just thinking, you've got a fire. It doesn't fall apart because there's a war in Venezuela. You've got a fire. That should be claimable if you've got fire insurance.
What I mean, though, is what kind of insurance should people be considering if they think the conflict in all these places is worth insuring against?
I think that's a fair point.
Business interruption insurance, for example?
Yep, I think business interruption where you can't get your supply chain. I think it's quite hard to get it for your customers, but you can get it where it looks at loss of profit rather than your cost base. And so you've got to look at your policy in detail and decide, do you want compensated for your costs of having to pay extra because you can't get goods coming in from this area? And you want to look at, or do you want to say, look, I've got a loss of profit because my customers can't collect their goods, for example. I can't ship my goods to my customers. So you've got to use two ways of looking at it, and I think it's worthwhile going through with your broker, and to be honest, probably your accountant, so you can understand the difference, the levels of compensation. The other option you mentioned was hedging. It's again finding a big organization, typically like a bank, that says, I will pay you financial compensation if your costs have gone up.
Costs like?
Or your revenue's been adjusted. So you're looking at a financial product. It's not a perfect hedge.
But hedging is specifically for things like currency or things like commodities,
currencies, indexes, and inflation, etc. You buy a hedge, effectively a promise to pay if the prices have moved in a different way. Now, depending on the type of hedge, if the prices have gone in your favour, you might have to pay the bank, and if it's gone against you, the bank should pay you.
You're effectively setting the price of that future thing you need to buy.
Yeah, exactly. And there's obviously a cost to this because the bank wants to make money for taking that risk. And you need to, if nothing changes in the world, it's probably costing you. But it means that you might still be able to trade and that risk is managed.
What about things like cash buffers?
Yeah, the more resilience you have in your business, whether that's having cash in the bank to pay more for goods, or just pay people quicker to make sure you get quicker delivery, going to other suppliers so you've got supply chain protection, so you don't just buy from Taiwan and China. Think of whether you can buy it from Australia or Africa or somewhere like that. Give yourself a bit of resilience. That may come at a price, but that resilience is worth it in the long run.
Yeah.
I think the car industry has been able to use different chips. And if you look at batteries, there's a big concern around the rare earth minerals are in batteries. So they're now looking at building batteries without that technology.
Yeah, like sodium batteries are coming out.
Exactly. So you're looking at people who say, let's go back to what we provide. Can we provide it differently? So we're no longer saying, I buy batteries from China with goods from China. We're saying, actually, I've redesigned the battery. So it means that, but to do that, you have to have the financial resources to be able to develop that product. Now, if you're the engineer, then maybe you can do that. But if you've got a team of engineers, then you've got to be able to pay these engineers to develop a new product, which might not get payback. It's a risk. But that's what's happening. The geopolitical angst, as I call it, around the world is such that you need to have a little bit of resilience.
What about, say, for example, you've got customers in Venezuela or Taiwan, and you're thinking, well, I'm not sure I should give them 60 days to pay. I should probably get my money a bit quicker just in case it kicks.
Yeah. And they might not be able to afford it. So even if they want to pay, they might legally not be able to get the money out of the country. Secondly, the exchange rate might have moved against them so that they can't afford to pay you, because if you're pricing in sterling or euros or dollars and they're in their local currency where, quite frankly, because of the war, it's just devalued tremendously.
Well, Iran's had that right recently.
Yeah.
So the last 4 days of, protests in the streets have been largely because inflation's gone up massively to a really unaffordable level, and their currency is kind of becoming worthless over time.
Well, what it means is that they can't afford to pay you. So if you're supplying people with those impacts, well, you're charging the same. They can't afford to pay you.
Yeah, the same in pounds, but now it's 10 times it
for them. The same if we were buying goods in another country, we'd have the same issue. So I think we need to look at to all aspects of it. But it goes back down to a little bit of ingenuity, thinking around what are the opportunities, what are the consequences, can I take advantage of it, can I manage this risk? But ultimately, geopolitics is always going to be there. You've always got the do nothing option. But I always say the do nothing option, it is an option, but it has to be considered. It's not a lazy answer. There's no such thing as lazy answers in this. You've got to make decisions. You can always change your decision, but you have to make a decision. If your decision is, I'm going to do nothing, that's fine. But you've made a conscious decision of it, and you can monitor that decision and decide it's the right one. If it turns out it's the wrong one, you change it. That's where the public sector goes wrong. It doesn't want to make a wrong decision. It's paralyzed by fear of getting the wrong decision. Well, in business, you make it wrong. Yeah, but you change it.
Yeah. I mean, are there any other sort of low-hanging fruit sort of options? Sort of start making yourself maybe financially more resistant, or be making like decisions like
be talking to your MP, talking with politicians and say, look, we've got this risk of whether we can get availability of batteries or oil. We buy oil from Venezuela. What are we going to do? Now, if it's oil, they'll probably say, go somewhere else for your oil. It's a commodity. But if there's something around specific that you need, then articulate it, and maybe your MP will be able to get you some sort of special treatment as an industry, not you on your own, but you make your case to say why you are important for UK employment, the consequences if you can't do it, etc. And you might be able to argue that politicians look after you. The other thing is to try and act as a trade body. So pull together all your competitors. If you don't have one, pull them together. If not, go to your trade body. And what you're looking again to do is get political influence. So what you're saying is, look, my business is affected by things outside my control. That isn't fair. We accept unfairness in society, but it's actually going to have a negative effect on the country. People are going to lose their jobs. There's less income to be taxed. There's less thing. This is not good for the UK. Forget about me, just not good for the UK. Can you, as politicians, do anything to help me? Whether that's grants, whether that's loans, whether that's export guarantees, what is it that's available to enable me to continue to meet the needs of my business?
Do you think there's any merit in getting, some overdraft facilities in place just as a backup plan?
Look, anyone who's got finances should be thinking about, or if anyone who's not got cash resources should be thinking, what happens if I have customers paying me late? Forget geopolitical issues, just customers pay me late. Can I afford it? How would I deal with it? There are certain things you can't not pay. Normally things like rent and salaries. You know, you kind of got to pay them. If you got a loan, you got to pay the bank. There's certain taxes. There's certain things you just got to pay. And so how do you cope? Well, if you don't have that ability to manage your cash flow, you know, paying people an extra week later will create a lot of money. But if you can't do that, then maybe you have to have an overdraft. The problem with things like an overdraft is the terms. Normally the bank lends it to you when you don't need it and doesn't let you draw it down when you do. So you need to be very careful, scrutinize it. Speak to your accountant, your lawyer, if you're unclear with it, gives you what you need.
Maybe for slightly larger businesses, but in terms of governance, if you've got a larger business, they need to sort of be ahead of the game on risks. Shame we don't have Tanzel on here.
Yes, no, he's very up. Look, I've had some good chats with Tanzel about this. And look, you need every business, doesn't matter what size it is, needs to be able to know its risk and ideally quantify it. And I suspect anyone watching this podcast will do so. They'll do it to their lives on a daily basis. Whether should I cross the road here or not? Should I buy this pint of milk, this pint of beer? And you look at the risks of it. You don't necessarily jot it down in a risk matrix. And that's what the bigger businesses do. They're much better at evidencing the decisions they've made and the thought process they've made behind it. And then putting in place this process to monitor it. So I crossed the road at this time all the time at this place. Why? Well, I just thought it was the right place. And then over time, yeah, it turned out it was. I don't get run over. These businesses are documenting, I'm not to say, as a bit of a silly example, but it's documenting the risks. They understand it, they document it, you manage it. And I think all businesses do it. But sometimes when there's time of strife, we take shortcuts. And I think that if you've got 10 minutes, write down the big things that make a difference to your business. Write them down. And then turn around and just you don't have to quantify, that's always difficult and up for debate. Just put a traffic light system. Red's a problem, green's okay, and orange is somewhere in the middle. And just update it every month, every quarter. Have a look at it. Discuss it with other, your spouse, your accountant. Discuss it with them. See if there's anything that needs to change. Ideally, you want to move all the reds into greens. But if you start off saying, I have no risk, then you haven't done the job properly because you can't make money without taking risk. So every business has a risk. If you're a one-man band as an IT contractor and you've got a big contract, working service, you're doing really well, you've got cash buffers, you feel fine. What's your risk? Well, the risk is the industry overtakes me and my skills are no longer required. So how do I deal with that? Well, I could retrain. I could build extra skills. And you can then choose the timing of doing that. That means I've only got one customer. What happens if they take a change in direction or decide a different approach? What can I deal with? Well, you have to either get other customers, get closer to your clients. You're aware of those issues ahead of time. Make yourself indispensable, some sort of long-term need, whether that's, you do something for free every year, you update something that only you're able to do, you find ways and means. Ultimately, everybody takes risk. Your risk assessment will always say, I'm taking some risk.
And with all that in mind, I anticipate that there'll be a lot of private equity firms, banks, who are also looking at all this uncertainty and saying, oh, not sure whether that changes our decision on lending over here or an investment over here.
Certainly, I think either a business or a bank, doesn't really matter, but if you're on top of it and you're demonstratively on top of it. So the one-man band person who says, yeah, I know all my risks, I've gone through it, as you said, Stuart, I'm on top of it. If you haven't documented it, you can't evidence it, right? And whether you like it or not, a bank looking at your business or a private equity firm looking at it or a government looking at whether they give you support, if you can turn around and give them a risk assessment straight away, a risk matrix, we often call it, and then an assessment on the side of that, straight away, right off the top, they go, oh, you're on top of your business. You know what's going on. So I say, I believe you. You've got a risk. I believe it's a real risk. How are we going to deal with it? We're going to come to the table and try and support you because you're on top of your business. If you said, well, we didn't think this was a risk, we didn't know it was going to happen, and it happened, and what do I do? Can you help me? It's a very different argument from saying, look, we're on top of it, we've dealt with this, we thought about this is how we've managed it, and we've got all these other risks, here we go, done. Big difference. It's about giving people confidence.
Yeah. And what would our advice be to say businesses, whether that's in the UK or globally, who are thinking about investing buying other businesses, investing in new plant and machinery, perhaps? Is that tying up capital that we might need?
Well, you've got to work out, it's an interesting one. It depends on the business. There's no right answer here. If you're running the business so tight financially, then you might not be able to afford that equipment because you've got additional risk. That's, in theory, you need that money aside to manage that risk. If you don't have that money aside, then you probably can't invest in that machinery. And if you have to, then you're in a situation where you're taking a huge amount of extra risk to get that machinery, which might pay off, might not, but it's a huge risk, right? So I think every business is different and there's no right answer. But again, it goes back down to do the analysis, talk with people, understand your business, look at what the decision means. You may need that equipment in order to remain cost competitive because the price of oil's gone up and your customers can't pay anymore. You might be forced down that route, but do so in the knowledge of what it does. Think about other options of financing that equipment. Can I lease it? Lenders are much happier if they've got security. So if they've got a piece of equipment to lend against, whether it's a car or whatever it is, they're much happier to lend to you. So if you need that new car to get your costs down because you're burning diesel and London has got an emissions charge, then perhaps you're thinking about an electric vehicle. You can get a lease on that car to keep your costs down. And that keeps you cost competitive.
Not sure what else.
Well, thank you very much.
Not sure what else.
Well, thank you very much. Look, Edmund, I've really enjoyed this series. We've done six of these podcasts. We've done 6 now. 6. I'd like to say I'm a seasoned campaigner on them, but I think I'm far from it. And I look forward to the next series. Thank you very much.
In series 2, we're actually going to be interviewing one of our very own, and his name is Tanzil Khan.
Very impressive.
Tanzil is a fantastic addition to the Acumen team. He used to oversee the internal audit team for a national firm, a very large national firm, and has an absolute wealth of experience doing internal audit for a number of massive retailers, as well as very well-known financial institutions like the bank, and even had a stint in the FCA. So join us next time on series 2, where we're going to be talking about a whole number of governance and risk, cyber, and other threats to businesses, and how to deal with making sure everything's mitigated as it should be.